The social 5 is a sponge of knowledge. He absorbs more and more knowledge of his interests as much as he possibly can. The basic motivation of the social E5 is to fill, through knowledge, the feeling of lack and emptiness with which it is permanently in contact. Knowledge and being becomes confused for the social E5. Knowledge is their life source. He lives in his mental world, absorbed in his theories, as his way to explain reality without experiencing it. The social E5 compensates for everything with their knowledge. I know, therefore I am, is the motto that the social E5 employs within their life. Knowledge is his amusement park and, at the same time, a lifeline against feeling insecure and inferior. Excessive intellectuality protects him, reducing the tension of the fear of not belonging, first in the family, then in social groups. The form found by this character is not to be the protagonist, but from afar to observe and absorb all forms of knowledge. He uses knowledge to replace the sense of loneliness and isolation, which is replaced by a sense of self-importance and belonging. Being a part of the head triad, the Self-Preservation 7 is also a mental character. Just like the Enneagram 5, he believes that the world is a dangerous place, he feels he is always under threat, and therefore uses intelligence as a way to think ahead and plan in order to put things into his favour. The charlatan is skilled in moulding situations to his advantage. One way that search for knowledge manifests is as selective interest in others. The gluttonous character picks and chooses who is worthy of their interests, only taking interest in those they deem exciting. In this vein, both types are similar as they take selective interest in people, however for slightly differing reasons. The social 5 lacks confidence, which means that they often have trouble in relationships. They distance themselves from any kind of connection or intimacy. The fear always exists that they will be devoured by the other. He distrusts that he can be loved or understood, so therefore distances himself from the other. Greed manifests here in the idea that by indulging in relationships, he loses a part of himself, the catastrophe of being left without. The social E5 has developed the psychic defense, making him forget his capability to love. He is so worried about losing himself in his relationships that he disconnects from this effective need to be loved. Compartmentalization is one way which the social E5 distances themselves from others. This is a process in which they separate emotions and feelings from the intellectual side of themselves. Through compartmentalization, the social E5 loses not only emotional contact with the people around them, but also the emotion attached to past experiences. His memories are like a black and white silent movie, in which we see the image but lack the colours and sounds to complete. Although of all the misers the social 5 cultivates friendships the most, his window for relationships remains narrow, and even if they have a wide circle, they are pseudo-relationships, contacts with little commitment and almost zero intimacy. Like all actions for the Self-Preservation 7, relationships are seen as a business deal, a way to secure what he wants, either his greedy interests or another way to repress his feelings of lack. Family in this type is built on a mutual agreement. If I help you, you'll help me. There is a small inner circle of trust in this type, loyalty to those they consider family. Contrary to the implication, they aren't necessarily family people. Closeness and intimacy is a struggle, with this type lacking the ability for good communication, transparency, affection, and trust. Loyalty is extremely important in this type, who are typically known as mobsters due to their extreme loyalty. The Conservation 7 is that person who makes alliances. Family could be an alternative word, but not the true sense of the term, which is full of positive connotation. Their word families describes an aspect of life, but in the specialized vocabulary of the ego, there is a kind of family game that can be played. In it, the Self-Preservation 7 builds relationships with people, which are based on ideas such as, I will be family to you and I demand that you are family to me. Family here is a passion for inclusiveness that implies the exclusion of those who aren't family. The world outside this bubble has little meaning to him. One of the main crazy ideas for this enneatype is that there is nothing in the world of relationships that interests me much. They operate with the belief that there is no value in the world of relationships. They don't allow themselves to set expectations for bonds of love, as setting expectations means that they are bound to suffer disappointment. The E5 separates himself both physically and emotionally due to the fear of being devoured. The belief that he will receive little, therefore he gives little, is what he centers his relationships around. The social 5's lack of experiences throws him into a void which enlarges over time, as he is focused on retention. The inner life of the social 5 is often dull and boring due to the fact that they isolate themselves through their search for knowledge. This sense of emptiness that they experience goes hand in hand with an impoverished self-image and a feeling of worthlessness. The totem always believes that the knowledge they have gained is never enough, which leads them to isolate themselves further as they disregard what exists outside of this search. Through this, he ends up distancing himself from himself, becoming less and less alive. He runs the risk of ending up as a stone or wooden totem, motionless and lifeless. Like the Social 5, the Self-Preservation 7 also has an underlying fear that the world is an unsafe place which stems from their childhood. As a conservation type, thinking becomes a self-protective reaction, a way to put a barrier between himself and the world. The Self-Preservation 7 suffers the idea that he can't count on anyone, believing that because he is so selfish, so is everyone else, turning this character into a skeptic. However, this type is extremely trusting of those they consider family. Seeing little interest in those outside of their group leads them to naturally be less sociable characters in a wider scale. Sociability and humour can be seen as defensive mechanisms to distract from the barrier that they put up between themselves and others. In this sense, this is a fake sociability to hide a true isolating behaviour and schizoid ambiguity, where the need to be in a relationship is polarised by the neurotic need to withdraw. Like the E5, they aren't interested in forming relationships, but see them as opportunities, social connections, which they take interest in. The more forced into intimacy they are, the more stingy and withdrawn they become. Self-Preservation 7s come across as extremely generous and hospitable people, the first to offer help or support. However, these are like transactions to the Conservation 7, that hopefully by leaving the other in debt, they will reciprocate. Altruism is fed by self-interest. In the Social 5, there is what we call super-idealization, which leads him to look for something elevated and special that he cannot find in the concrete human world. The miser is someone who lives his life through his thoughts and ideals. His search for the extraordinary leads the Social E5 to despise ordinary people. They constantly seek knowledge in every aspect of their life. Whatever the object of his interest is, he will invest all his time and energy into this endeavour, taking the saved energy that he has from his lack of investment into human relationships. The Social E5 has the fantasy that he will only fill his existential emptiness through knowledge. He fantasizes that only when he finds something big will he be satisfied. The ideal of the Social E5 is totemized. The things around him are classified based on his own perception of worthiness. He judges everything through his lens, judging others, knowledge, and himself. Out of all the E7 types, the Conservation 7 doesn't fall into fantasy as often. However, for the Self-Preservation 7, there is a confusion between desire and need. Gluttony plays a role in this confusion. They live in the fantasy that their needs are less than they actually require. He describes his desires as basic, the earthly pleasures of the good life, rather than an overindulgence of their true needs. Moderation in this type, unlike in the Enneagram 5, feels like torture. Denying pleasure is like death to the 7. Both these types believe that they are above the people around them and therefore exist somehow in a way that others don't. The Social E5 does this through judging intellectually, whereas the gluttony of the Self-Preservation 7 leads him to believe that he is deserving of his hedonistic ways. The Social E5 uses rationalization through believing that they are always right. Their arrogance on how much knowledge they possess leads them to speak with such concrete certainty that it is easy for them to be extremely convincing to the other. Because they focus all their time and energy into their knowledge as opposed to emotions or actions, they can appear intellectually superior, making it easy for them to rationalize their points within arguments. They are stubborn about their knowledge, and therefore it is extremely difficult to tell them no or that they are wrong. Because of this, the Social 5 is able to rationalize his arrogant behavior by convincing himself he is always right and therefore has the right to look down on those who oppose his intellect. The Self-Preservation 7 operates under the belief that I'm fine and everything is fine. This is the defense mechanism that the Enneagram 7 employs. The charlatan is constantly pleasure-seeking and overindulging to keep himself in his cycle of gluttony, where he is able to have everything he wants. Rationalization is used to excuse this, the idea that he is somehow more deserving of overindulgence than those he surrounds himself with. The Conservation 7 rationalizes their behavior through the idea that they are above everything and everyone, both intellectually and socially. Altruism is used by the Self-Preservation 7 as a way to make himself appear right or just, rather than to make him appear as a self-serving hedonistic character. Self-Preservation 7s are typically most aware of their gluttony of all the E7 types, but this doesn't mean that they are openly accepting of it, as rationalization is still a strong defense mechanism in this type. Arrogance is one of the main characteristics of the Social E5, which seeks in knowledge the affirmation of its self-importance. The social E5 is very attached to his theories, making it extremely difficult for him to give up on them. This means that the miser struggles with sharing and externalizing his knowledge, which he views as a safety net against a world that he sees as constantly sucking everything he has. While the miser wants to be socially praised for his knowledge, he doesn't actually want to share it, and if he does share it, it's in the form of a teacher, where he can still uphold the image that he is more knowledgeable. The miser is always teaching, having a constant attitude of someone who knows more. Because of this, he cannot put himself in the position of learning, automatically believing he is superior to others, despising ordinary life and ordinary people. However, for the social 5, this arrogance is born really out of the belief that they are intellectually superior to those around them, not because they believe that they are special or indispensable. In line with this, the miser refuses to seek help, seeing it as a sign of weakness, showing a lack of knowledge or autonomy. The self-preservation 7 often struggles with authority, due to the strong belief that he is naturally smarter and better than said authority. This is a very mentally aggressive character. He believes that he is truly talented and that charm and conviction is what he needs to be able to succeed. This is a character who knows what he wants and how he can manipulate those around him to achieve his goal. While this character is head triad and therefore more mentally orientated, they don't seek knowledge for the sake of learning or for social standing, but they use it transactionally as a way to boost themselves. Like everything for the self-preservation 7, intellectualism is used as a way to guarantee not only their pleasure but also security. Being a self-preserving type, there is still heavy focus on safety in this character, even if they appear more reckless than types such as self-preservation 6 or self-preservation 9. Unlike the social 5, it is very easy for this character to externalize their knowledge, easily communicating thoughts and ideas with others. Because knowledge is transactional in this type, sharing and consuming knowledge with others makes their perspective a lot more flexible than the social 5, who tends to be extremely rigid in what he thinks and not as open to changing his mind. The self-preservation 7 is inside his inner circle. This is where he values the opinions and ideas of others a lot more, making discussions more interesting to him. He presents a great attachment to himself and a strong resistance to surrender, making opening up difficult for this type. For the social 5, who expresses himself through knowledge, he creates distance by not being able to open beyond what he knows. Sharing knowledge does not mean a deep exchange. On the contrary, it can alienate you from relationships, making you distant. Over the years, I realized that the search for autonomy and intimacy were part of my character. As for knowledge, I almost always developed it by myself, without having to resort to others. I wanted to learn on my own, develop on my own, create on my own, and not suffer any kind of external interference on what and how to think. I devoted all of my concentration and interest to mastering the ideas in order to retain the feeling of possessing something unknown. I liked that sometimes that became everything inaccessible to others. Greed for the E5 overshadows the ability they have to genuinely show generosity, but in the end he is someone who is not available to the other, who from the top of his ivory tower observes the world without getting involved or committing himself. Despite their outward appearance as a provocative and exciting character, the self-preservation 7 has a schizoid background, being emotionally stingy and finding it difficult to truly open up to others. For the Charlton, this behaviour is a facade to hide the true distance between themselves and the other. Superficiality is a tactic employed as a way to separate themselves from the reality of their emotions. These are both types that are not typically in touch with their emotions, however, they both present themselves in very different ways socially. While the social 5 is a typically extremely stoic character, not showing much emotions and keeping a facade of being unbothered, the facade of the self-preservation 7 is one of someone who plays the fool. They tend to keep a constant light-hearted and fun atmosphere for those around them. They use altruism, empathy, and humour as a way to keep up this positive appearance. This, however, doesn't mean that these types are naturally unhappy people, but that they are skilled in hiding their true emotions behind this facade, putting up a wall between themselves and the other that they believe will be able to keep themselves safe. The social 5 is both stingy with the other and with himself, never letting himself indulge and repressing his awareness of need until there is none. He believes that he will lose too much of what he already has if he asks for more, so he puts his focus and time into preserving it instead of experiencing. Unlike the self-preservation 7, the social 5 doesn't overindulge but rather underindulges, not giving himself opportunity or pleasure because of the belief that it is only fleeting. The miser applies his stinginess into his relationships with others. believing that because he sees certain needs as dispensable to him, they also are to everyone else. The social E5 always believes that their resources are limited, like all E5 types. Don't waste your time, energy, and resources on things that have nothing to do with that all-important quest you imagine yourself to be on. Greed in the social E5 manifests as a loss of interest in relationships. Greed leads to estrangement, which just reinforces the idea of greed even further. It isn't just about retaining, but also about keeping everything inside oneself so as to not turn it to anyone. Every conservation type has a survival strategy for themselves. The conservation 7's is material pleasure. Unlike the E5, the conservation 7 is clear and straightforward about what he wants. Always more, always better. The charlatan knows how to influence a network in order to get what they want, to implement their gluttony into the world. The conservation 7 has the need to surround himself with splendor and luxury, seeking to constantly have pleasure and ignoring that which does not. Gluttony in this type can often lead to self-destruction, as the Enneagram 7 can struggle with knowing when to stop their behavior, as it's easy to fall into temptation. For the self-preservation 7, the sin of gluttony is an addiction. He cannot stop himself. Gluttony is also used as a way to numb the pain in this type, a way of playing dead as a way to not come in contact with their pain. This is a type that exists in a depressive cycle, constantly hitting high through seeking pleasure as a way to distract himself from the lows. His gluttony is all-consuming, seeking refuge in an overindulgence of pleasure, using it as an antidote for a depressive and anxious character. The promise of excitement, it needs to be an immediate reality rather than an insufficient one. Out of all the E7 types, the self-preservation 7 is the one with his feet on the ground, less absorbed in fantasy and more self-indulgent. Although gluttony makes the self-preservation 7 appear as greedy or stingy, he is not. Unlike the E5, the self-preservation 7 enjoys contributing and sharing with the circle he considers family. While he seeks material pleasure, he isn't a hoarder like the social 5, sharing more freely with those he trusts, expecting the same from them.